Good evening, everybody. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the German-Irish Association of Würzburg. We are delighted to co-host today's inaugural John Millington Synge lecture, together with Irish Studies Würzburg, ISWÜ. We like to call Würzburg the Irish town on the continent, and in fact we share a lot of history with Ireland. The arrival of the Irish monks Cillian and his companions, who came to Würzburg in the 7th century and were martyred here, was the first recorded contact between our two countries, Germany and Ireland. And for more than 1300 years now, up to the present day, the relations between Würzburg and Ireland have never been cut off. Some of the oldest existing records of written Irish are kept in the university library, and until today they are regarded as important sources of Irish identity, attracting visitors like the Irish President Michael D. Higgins in 2019. In our time, Würzburg has a number of close contacts with Ireland. The very active twinning with Bray in County Wicklow, established in 1999, 5 exchange programs so far between schools in Würzburg and Ireland, church contacts with Mulla, the birthplace of St. Cillian in County Cavan, to name but a few. In 1986, 1300 years after the Irish monks came to Würzburg, the German-Irish Association, Deutsch-Irische Gesellschaft Würzburg, was founded, organizing activities with an Irish background like lectures, like today, whiskey tastings or evenings of music and storytelling is one side of our commitment, but extending the German-Irish network by establishing and supporting contacts between people and institutions both in Würzburg and Ireland is also an important part of our work. Today we look forward to the first of a series of annual John Millington Synge lectures, and on behalf of the German-Irish Association of Würzburg, I would like to thank ISWÜ Irish Studies Würzburg for all their enthusiasm and commitment. And many thanks also to the Embassy of Ireland for their financial support of this lecture. Just a final remark, this lecture will be recorded, so anyone who doesn't like to appear on the recording may now switch off their cameras. Thank you very much for your attention and have a nice evening, have a nice lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. A very warm welcome from me as well on behalf of the whole Irish Studies Würzburg team. Irish Studies Würzburg, ISWÜ, is a cooperation under the umbrella of the European Federation of Associations and Centres of Irish Studies, Ephesus, which unites the major national professional associations in the field of Irish studies, as well as about 50 academic centers in over 25 European countries. ISWÜ offers opportunities for cooperation and international dialogue to scholars, PhD students, students of English, non-academic circles, and simply all those interested in Irish issues. ISWÜ is engaged in the study of the literature, language, history, and culture of the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Irish diaspora. Our activities have so far included authors' readings, guest lectures, workshops, study days, and more. And if you weren't able to attend any of our events before, you can find many recordings of the events on our website. We are also involved in the organization of cultural events such as the Irish Itinerary. So, but why focus on Ireland or global Ireland at Julius Maximilians Universität Würzburg, JMU? And Matthias has already hinted at some of the points I'll be coming back to now. Ever since the Irish monks Cillian, Colonat, and Totnan proselytized Franconia around 686 AD, Würzburg has been considered the Irish city on the continent. And one of our university library's proudest and indeed its oldest possession is the Cillian's Evangelia, an early medieval manuscript which over the years as Matthias has also said before, has attracted many eminent Irish guests, most noteworthy among them President Higgins and Ambassador O'Brien. Today, organizations like the Deutsch-Irische Gesellschaft and manifold activities by citizens and officials keep the close connection between the city and the Emerald Isle alive. Today marks the inaugural John Millington Synge lecture, which highlights another cultural connection between Ireland and Würzburg. As a young man, Synge came to Würzburg. In 1894, he spent 6 months here to study music. Eventually, he would return to Ireland, give up music, and start a career in literature. Certainly, Würzburg contributed toward that decision in one way or another. Synge is one of Ireland's best known and he's considered one of the most influential playwrights. Today, we kickstart and then hope to establish a yearly Synge lecture around the date of the playwright's birthday on April 16th, which will be co-organized by the Deutsch-Irische Gesellschaft and Irish Studies Würzburg. And this lecture is meant to highlight this lesser known, but even though equally important connection between Ireland and Würzburg. We are not just harking back to the missionaries here. This lecture will be dedicated to introducing new Synge scholarship, cutting-edge Synge scholarship, as well as highlighting the cultural exchange between Ireland and Germany. Irish Studies Würzburg is thankful for the support of this lecture by both Deutsch-Irische Gesellschaft Würzburg and the Embassy of Ireland, the Department of Foreign Affairs. We would like to do a quick screenshot for our website now. So if you don't want to be in the picture, please turn off your cameras for a minute. If you want to be in a picture, say cheese. And Franca, please do some screenshots now. Maybe you can prompt us.
Okay, it will be, I will take a picture on 3. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, I take another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll put that on our website and you can see how we all fared. So I'm now passing on the word to my colleague Maria, who will introduce our guest lecturer, Professor Patrick Lonergan.
Yes, thank you, Ina, for this introduction, and thank you also, Matthias. Good evening, everybody, and also a warm welcome from myself. And I have the pleasure to introduce our guest lecturer to you all tonight. So Patrick Lonergan is Professor of Drama and Theatre Studies at National University of Ireland, Galway, and is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He was the director of the Synge Summer School from 2008 to 2013, and his edited collection, Synge and His Influences, gathers together some of the papers that were delivered during those years. He has written and edited many other books about Irish theatre, including, I just name 1 or 2, Theatre and Globalization, but also Irish Drama and Theatre since 1950. He has lectured on Irish drama in many international locations, including Princeton, Tokyo, Singapore, Cambridge, etc., many places all around the world, basically. And he was one of the keynote speakers of the 2021 conference of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures, where he lectured about Lady Gregory Druid Theatre and the Anthropocene. Patrick, we are very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So let me just share a screen before I do anything else. Now, so I hope you can see that. Can somebody tell me if you can see that? Good, and you can also hear me as well. So yeah, well, thank you very much. So first of all, thanks very much indeed for the invitation to be here today. It's an incredibly huge honor to deliver the inaugural lecture about John Millington Synge, a really important writer. And, you know, my only regret is that I can't be there in person to talk to you in real life. But, you know, I look forward to doing so before too long. And similarly, I want to say, you know, if any of you ever find yourself in Galway, I'd really be delighted to meet any of you participants or organizers here and welcome you and show you some of these places that I'm going to be talking about today. Anyway, the title of the paper is Rereading Synge in an Era of Climate Crisis. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to suggest that through reading Synge, a writer from the past, we can generate new ways of thinking about the present, new approaches indeed to the future as well. And I'll be talking about this specifically in relation to the climate crisis, but also the broader ecological problems with biodiversity and water, species extinction, and all of those other things. I'm going to begin with an episode from Synge's book, The Aran Islands, which, for those of you who don't know it, is a prose account of his visit to these 3 islands, Gaelic-speaking islands off the coast of County Galway. And he visited them several times in the late 1890s. So it's a really interesting book, but there's an episode that I specifically want to focus on, which is a moment of tragedy in the life of a community, which arises when a family are evicted from their home because they have failed to pay rent. So what Synge tells us is that there had been previous attempts to evict families from their homes on Inishmaan, which is the middle island, and that's the island that Synge spent most of his time on when he was in the Aran Islands. And this is what he writes. 2 recent attempts to carry out evictions on the island came to nothing. For each time a sudden storm rose by, it is said, the power of a native witch when the steamer was approaching, and made it impossible to land. So a native witch, the assumption being that this was a witch who lived on Inishmaan and was trying to protect her fellow islanders. But anyway, on the 3rd occasion, the landing did happen, and much to Synge's dismay indeed. This is what he says. When the anchor had been thrown, it gave me a strange throb of pain to see the boats being lowered, and the sunshine gleaming on the rifles and helmets of the constabulary who crowded into them. Now, Synge's writings about the Aran Islands are often presented as ethnography, as factual accounts of the life of a primitive people on Europe's westernmost edge. And certainly that's a valid way of reading the books. They do provide factual information, and they've been used in scholarship by anthropologists and by folklorists and by historians. But what I want to suggest is that this passage shows us how the book is also written by somebody who was an artist. Images of light and darkness abound in the Aran Islands, and they're often used in very surprising ways. And so the descriptions of weather that I've just read out to you are a good example, I think, of this feature of Synge's writing. So readers at that time, and it's probably true to a certain extent now as well, would have been used to the convention that bad weather in writing usually symbolizes bad news, the proverbial storm clouds on the horizon that signal that something negative is looming in the lives of a character in a novel. And then similarly, sunlight often symbolizes positive things like hope or revelation or clarity. And again, you know, the proverbial beam of light that brings knowledge or revelation, or which allows new things to come forth. But here in the Aran Islands, the meaning of those symbols is reversed. So the storm is not negative, it's not a force for evil, it's actually there for protection. It's keeping the peasants safe from eviction. And as you can see from the image on your screen, an Aran Island storm is not to be taken lightly by somebody coming in on a steamboat. And then we have the sunlight. And again, far from being good, the sunlight gives Synge a throb of pain. It illuminates only the helmets and the guns of the constabulary who are coming to get rid of these tenants. So this is a passage in which the forces of law and order are being used to commit a moral outrage by evicting people from their homes. And I think for Synge, this represents an inversion of the ordinary relationship between law and justice. And he emphasizes that by himself inverting the relationship between the weather and his readers' expectations. So he's giving us a literary representation of the natural environment that is also discordant or absurd or out of harmony with what his readers might be expecting. As he continues to write, though, he says that the police do occasionally show moments of compassion. So as they go to the various islanders' homes that are in arrears, the police sometimes do allow the residents to stay on. So, for example, one of the houses has a family with a daughter who's very sick. So they, deliver the eviction notice, but then they let the family stay on. Eventually, however, they are obliged to force a family out of their home. And this is what Synge writes. About midday, a house was reached where there was no pretext for mercy and no money could be procured. At a sign from the sheriff, the work of carrying out the beds and utensils was begun in the middle of a crowd of natives who looked on in absolute silence, broken only by the wild imprecations of the woman of the house. So this is an upsetting scene when you read it, and I've sometimes wondered if the fact that it happens at midday, again, the proverbial high noon, is that an accurate reflection of a real event that Synge is trying to record faithfully, or is that timing there from a desire to impose a kind of artistic coherence on it? I don't know the answer to that question, but either way, it's a scene that for anyone familiar with the culture of 19th century Ireland would have been all too common. So in the 19th century, Irish peasants did not own the land that they farmed. So instead, they were obliged to pay rent to absentee landlords who usually lived in England or Scotland, and who, because they had, often very limited connections to Ireland, didn't always care if their tenants found themselves unable to pay rent due to unavoidable things like crop failures caused by bad weather. So the system of tenancy came to be seen as a huge injustice. It was viewed as one of the causes of the Great Famine of the 1840s, which reduced Ireland's population by half. And then it also fueled the movement towards Irish independence from Britain during subsequent decades. And so the eviction became a kind of byword for all that was wrong with Ireland in the second half of the 19th century. We see it being represented very frequently in visual art, for example. And this is a painting from, I think it's 1851. And just like in Synge's prose account, it combines realistic representation of an eviction with a certain amount of artistic embellishment. So if you're a viewer of this painting with an anthropological interest, you will probably appreciate its authenticity. You'll appreciate the patched roof, or the fact that the woman has red in her clothing, which is one of the characteristics of the Irish peasantry. But I think its artistic power arises from the position of the human figures. So you've got the adults here who cannot bring themselves to look at the viewer, so ashamed and despondent are they. But then we have the children there who are sitting on the roof, gazing directly out at us, as if in despair for the future. Theirs is a gaze that looks at us to answer a question that we cannot provide the answers to. Evictions were also commonly represented in journalism. So illustrations of Irish evictions, like the one you can see on the screen right now, these can be found in magazines and in newspapers and in novels all across Europe from the 1860s onwards. This one is intended, I think, to be more illustrative than artistic, but it still has quite a dramatic quality. You can see the woman on her bended knees pleading for her home while the landlord's agent, mounted on his horse, looms above her. And it's almost as if this group of people here are silently recreating a tableau from a 19th century melodrama with those exaggerated gestures. Even into the present, the cultural memory of eviction continues to occupy an immensely powerful place in the Irish imagination. So much so that this year, a century after the country became independent, there has been a controversy about the purchase of Irish property by international investors, which has drawn parallels with the land wars of the 19th century. So again, that idea that this shouldn't happen because it happened before. Similarly, one of the most powerful recent Irish movies, the Irish language film Oireachd, or Monster, it centers around a traumatic relationship between a landlord and a tenant. And I really do hope, if you haven't seen that film, that you get the opportunity to do so. But again, it shows the power and the persistence of the trauma of these land problems. So when Synge wrote about eviction, he was telling his readers something that they already knew about. But he also offers them something that they wouldn't have encountered often before, which is the perspective of that old woman, the old woman of the house. And this is what he writes. She belonged to one of the most primitive families on the island, and she shook with uncontrollable fury as she saw the strange armed men who spoke a language she could not understand, English, driving her from the hearth she had brooded on for 30 years. For these people, the outrage to the hearth is the supreme catastrophe. They live here in a world of grey, where there are wild rains and mists every week in the year, and their warm chimney corners, filled with children and young girls, grow into the consciousness of each family in a way it is not easy to understand in more civilized places. There's a really important phrase there, this outrage to the hearth. And I think it is a statement of the centrality of the fireplace to Irish social and family life. And this is a theme that Synge returns to several times in the... So for example, he tells us that most children, when they're born in the islands, are not given a name until they're able to walk. And the expression to describe a child who's able to walk is you say that the child has left the hearth. So this is there as a way to establish the material reality of the world that Synge is trying to create on stage. But the hearth starts to be used in other interesting ways as well. So in the Playboy of the Western World, for instance, the widow Quinn attempts to seduce the play's hero, Christy Mahan, by telling him the following: "There's maybe worse than a dry hearth and a widow woman and your glass at night," she says. So here the widow Quinn is offering Christy a kind of trinity of desirable possessions. So we've got the pleasure of a glass of beer after your day's work. You've got the companionship of a woman who, being a widow, would know a thing or two about life. And in first place, you've got the security of a dry hearth. So that's the number one, the dry hearth. The image on your screen, by the way, is of Sarah Allgood, the Abbey actress, playing the widow Quinn in 1911. And Sarah's sister Molly was Synge's fiancée, and Molly was the actress for whom Synge wrote the role of Peggy and Mike in the Playboy. Just mention that in passing. The fireplace in Synge, then, it operates like fireplaces and furnaces do, I often think, in plays by somebody like Ibsen. They're shown on stage to assert to the audience that the world that they're seeing in the theatre operates according to laws that correspond to the laws of real life. But those set pieces, they also work symbolically. So at various times in the plays of Ibsen, a fireplace can represent passion or security, or in a play like Hedda Gabler, it can represent destructive force. And so Synge, I think, learned from that. He uses fireplaces in similar ways. But what he also does is he relates it very strongly to Irish identity. As he explains in the Aran Islands, he writes that the outrage to a tomb in China probably gives no greater shock to the Chinese than the outrage to a hearth in Inishmaan gives to the people. So the hearth is fundamental to who these people are, and its destruction for Synge is akin to the desecration of a grave. Well, I was reminded of these words recently when driving past a newly built housing estate on the outskirts of Dublin. where I saw houses large and small, a few blocks of apartments, plenty of space for cars. Lest you think I was driving by in a helicopter, I should say that this is not the estate. It's one that I found online that looks like it. But the reason I've included this is because as I was going past it, I noticed an absence on these houses. I noticed there was something I was expecting to see, but wasn't seeing. And that was chimneys. There are no chimneys on the roofs of these houses. And that, of course, is because it is part of Ireland's national policy that we should no longer burn fossil fuels as a way of trying to prevent the impact of global warming, climate change, as a way of improving the heating of our houses, and so on. So this represents a change. On Synge's Aran Islands, the people burned turf that was imported from the mainland, peat turf. And when they ran out of turf, they burned dried cow dung. So yeah, think about how that would smell in your kitchen. The turf, of course, would have put carbon into the atmosphere when it was burned. Dried cow dung, I presume, would have released methane. If there's a scientist present, you can confirm that, but I would assume that's the case. And then in independent Ireland, people continued to burn turf. They also burned coal, usually imported from Britain, and sometimes timber as well. Nowadays, most Irish homes continue to burn fossil fuels, mostly oil and gas, and still sending carbon out into our atmosphere. But as new houses are being built, people are heating their homes in different ways, with solar panels or geothermal heating or other forms of renewable electricity. So no more chimneys and no more fireplaces. So that means that Irish people in these new homes can no longer gather around the hearth. But I never hear anyone suggesting that we have lost some crucial feature of our national identity. On the contrary, I think there's an understanding that in order for there to be an Ireland to live in a century from now, we just have to do things differently. So that desecration of the hearth that Synge writes about, that passage, I think would probably resonate with the majority of people in Ireland today if they read that. But I wonder, would it be meaningful to the children who are growing up in those chimneyless houses in 30 or 40 or 50 years? Maybe not, or at least not in the same way. One of the biggest barriers to climate action, we're often told, is the need to persuade people to change behavior that they regard as in some way essential to their sense of self. So here in Ireland in recent weeks, there's been a raging debate about whether people can continue to cut turf in rural Ireland. And this is something that our government wants to prohibit because they want to protect biodiversity and, again, prevent further environmental damage. But what's been very notable about this debate is that so much of it has focused on culture rather than economics or energy policy or ecology. People say that they want to continue to cut turf because they think that doing so is part of who they are. And they say that with sincerity and very assertively so as well. And you can see this kind of emotional attachment to perhaps outmoded forms of behavior that damage the environment in lots of other contexts. You see it in countries where fossil fuels are often linked with national identity. Think about the way many people in Australia feel about coal, for example, or the way many people feel in parts of the United States about oil. You can also see it with food. One of the arguments that's often made about climate change is that people should eat less beef and dairy. But that's a lot more complicated in countries that view dairy farming not just as an industry, but as part of their intangible cultural heritage, which is the case, for example, in France. UNESCO has recognized French gastronomy as cultural heritage. And so there's this link then between nation and nature that explains the emotional ties that many people in our societies have to forms of behavior that damage the environment. Natural life and national identity are often, when represented culturally, intertwined, and they therefore become confused. But a reading of that short passage that I began with from the Aran Islands shows that there are circumstances in which a change of attitudes is possible. The words hearth and home used to be so clearly linked in Ireland that they were almost synonymous with each other. And you can see that here from this poster advertisement for an exhibition in our National Museum. But this isn't the case any longer. And as I said, no one seems to feel any less secure in their identity as a result. So change is possible. And that leads really to the point that I'm trying to make throughout this whole paper, which is that just as, geologists can form theories about climate based on looking at ice cores in Greenland, it's also possible for literary and cultural scholars to excavate important truths about the ecological crisis by looking through the layers of our cultural past, at plays, novels, poems, music, songs, and so on. Now, in one way, of course, this is saying something that we've known for quite some time. The field in academic literature of eco-criticism has been with us for more than a quarter of a century at this stage. And it's been true, especially in Ireland, where there have been many important studies of the relationship between literature and the environment, some of which I popped up on the screen there. But my suggestion would be that the Irish case study is particularly useful because writers like Synge, like William Butler Yeats, like Lady Gregory, they wrote about nature and nation, not as entities that exist independently of the human, but as objects that are known through a process of cultural creation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Ireland was, as Declan Kiberd famously observed, an invention in his book, Inventing Ireland. But nature was also an invention, at least as it was presented in literature. Yes, of course, people understood that there was a real natural world that actually exists. But what they were thinking about is how literature was used to present nature in a way that was too narrow, that was too focused on the human, that saw the natural world as a symbol or a backdrop or as a metaphor for human life. In one sense, this is saying something that we've known for quite some time. The field of eco-criticism has been thriving for more than 25 years at this stage. And that's been true in Ireland, where there have been many important studies, some of which you can see on your screen. However, my suggestion is that the Irish case study is particularly useful because writers such as Synge, William Butler Yeats, and Lady Gregory wrote about nature and nation, not as entities that exist independently of the human, but on the contrary, as objects that are known through culture. Ireland was, as Declan Kiberd famously observed, an invention, but so too was nature an invention, something that was understood through literature. You might think about Yeats's great poem, The Fisherman. This is what Yeats writes. He says, "Although I can see him still, the freckled man who goes to a grey place on a hill in grey Connemara clothes at dawn to cast his flies. It's long since I began to call up to the eyes the wise and simple man. All day I'd looked in the face what I had hoped it would be to write for my own race and the reality." So Yeats in this poem, which is about this fisherman who is seen as an icon for the Irish relationship with nature, Yeats admits later in that poem that the fisherman is a fiction. What he says is that the fisherman is, and the quote is, "a man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream." So what that means is that we're finding in Yeats, he has the ability to rhyme the word reality with the phrase hoped it would be. And that makes a new kind of sense. So for Yeats, when he thinks about nature, reality is not nature that exists. Reality is nature as we conceive of it in our imagination, as we hope it would be. So what this is showing is that the literature of the Irish Revival is a way for people to think about how nature is a way for people to explain themselves to themselves and to each other. And writers like Yeats, they're not saying that's a good thing, quite the opposite. They're saying that it's too narrow, that it's fictitious, that it's artificial. The point of Yeats's poem, after all, is not that the fisherman is real, but that the fisherman is not real. Now, Synge is really important in this context because he understood the natural world intimately. He didn't see it as a symbol. He didn't see it as a metaphor for the human. He understood it as something that human beings were part of. And when he wrote about it artistically, he wrote about its beauty, but he also wrote about the way in which it could overwhelm people as well. And so what I'm suggesting is that the writing of Synge contains an awful lot of ecological wisdom and practical information that we can go back to and that can give us helpful and interesting ways to think about the present. So I think this is important because if we're going to see theatre and other forms of culture as a kind of time capsule to explain how climate change might have happened, we're going to find some evidence that is positive, but other evidence that's going to trouble us. A good way of thinking about this is a book by Andreas Malm called Fossil Capital. And in that book, he very memorably described petrol burning cars as invisible missiles aimed at the future. And he says that that's the case because their emissions will have the greater climate altering impact on generations not yet born. So you turn the key in your car and it's a missile that's going to explode in somebody's life in 50 or 100 years. So if we accept the accuracy of that rather bleak statement, and I think we must accept the accuracy of that statement, then it also becomes necessary to start to think about whether plays, including plays written by people like Synge, can also be considered these kinds of invisible missiles directed at our descendants, you know, inadvertently, but still unavoidably. Because we know that when theatre makers, have burned fossil fuels when they illuminate their stages. They've used gaslight, they've used electricity generated from fossil fuels. When you have a show like Les Miserables that goes on tour around the world, it's in enormous trucks that go from place to place, spewing out fumes, to give just a few examples. Now, of course, those contributions to the climate crisis might be so small as to be negligible. Certainly nowhere near agriculture or aviation, but they're not nothing, they're not inconsequential. But perhaps a greater impact has arisen as a result of our culture's capacity not only to mirror, but to shape human attitudes towards the environment, towards the climate, towards other living beings, and indeed towards fossil fuels too. So theatre, alongside other forms of literature, has constructed audiences' understanding of the so-called real world by developing models of realism that often separate humans and the natural into separate categories. This is an argument that's been made in a number of different books, but a very accessible one is Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement. And in that book, he suggests that one of the causes of the climate crisis is that Western conceptions of realism have developed in such a way that when artists try to represent the realities of climate change, it seems like science fiction or fantasy when they do so. So through fictions and languages and other forms of cultural representation, the human species has organized the world in such a way that the climate crisis seems almost literally unbelievable, according to Ghosh. And that in turn affects audiences' sense of both urgency and agency. A few other things just to quickly bear in mind. I won't spend long on this, but just to cover some of the interesting work that's being done lately. Another theorist suggests that one of the things that art has done is it has allowed our species actually to suppress knowledge of our destructive impact on the environment. One example of that is a theorist called Jean-Baptiste Frézeau, who in L'Apocalypse Joyeuse argues that the discovery in the early 21st century that we were destroying the planet, he says that the idea that this was a new revelation to us was possible only through a process of forgetting about all of the planetary destruction we had been engaged in for the previous 300 or 400 years. So he sees that a lot of what culture does is it enables people to forget or to suppress awareness of what we've been doing since at least the 18th century. Another good example of this is Donna Haraway, who in her book where she's thinking about suitable terminology for the present time that we live in, she says the term Anthropocene, we shouldn't use that term. We should instead call the period since 1990 the dithering, because what she says is that in 1990, the IPCC for the United Nations published a report that said that climate change and human activity were absolutely provably connected to each other, but we didn't do anything about it, or we certainly didn't do enough. Instead, we have dithered. So important scholarly work has been done on literature and theatre's representation of the ecological, but we probably also need to spend more time thinking about how it has denied the ecological, how it has allowed us to dither, how it has launched missiles at the future. I'm not saying any of this was done deliberately, but nevertheless, it is still something to think about. So how might Irish theatre have contributed to this? Well, one example might be the way that Irish plays normalize the use of fossil fuels, such that their appearance on stage often appears as inevitable or natural or unremarkable. So in this context, you might think about the stage representation in Irish drama of turf. A stage property, and I haven't counted every single play, but I've done a search of a database. There is turf in at least a quarter of the Irish plays that were staged at our National Theatre during the 20th century. So that's more often than the stuff you might expect to see. It's more often than pictures of the Sacred Heart, such as the one that you see here in this picture. This is Druid Theatre's co-founder, Mick Lally, bringing that prop ashore to Inishmaan for a production of the Playboy of the Western World. Turf is there more often than the Sacred Heart. It's there more often than pint glasses. It's there more often than potatoes. It's there more often than loys. So, I mean, again, I can't prove this, but I suspect that turf must be the most frequently used stage property in the Irish theatre. But turf is present mostly to be invisible. People tend only to notice it when it's used for an unusual purpose, as for example, when Peggy and Mike burns Christie's leg with a sod of turf at the end of the Playboy of the Western World. And let me add at this point that these production photos are from Druid Theatre, and I'll say a bit more about them in a minute. Other forms of normalizing fossil fuel use happen through things like advertisements. So if you had gone to see a Synge play at the Abbey Theatre in the 1970s, you would have seen an advertisement for Esso, petrol company, in your show program, so your playbill. So people in companies like Esso, we now know, they knew in the 1960s that there was a link between burning oil and changing the climate. They knew that. I'm not saying people in Esso did, I'm not saying the advertising executives did, but we know that that was known. So it therefore feels significant that less than a decade later, we see petrol companies trying to link themselves with the national heritage that the Abbey presents by staging plays by people like Synge. And just look at how they do this. It's not high-tech highways or cars, it's traditional Irish culture. They're explaining that the Irish word for a road, boher, comes from the Irish word for a cow, bow. So what they're saying here is that if you buy a car and you fill it with petrol, that's not about destroying the future. That's about reconnecting with Irish heritage and the past and all of those noble things that the Abbey Theatre performs on stage. The plays on the Abbey stage, they might have reinforced some of those ideas in other ways. It's often the case with Abbey plays that supposedly realistic Irish dramas, they often happen in rooms rather than in ecosystems. And so when you get, trees or animals or things like that, they're there as context, or they're in the background, or they're there as symbol or decoration, but they're rarely there in and of themselves. Nicholas Green has written about this very interestingly in his book, The Politics of Irish Drama, where he says that a room within a house, a family within a room, stand in for nationality, for ordinary familiar life. Into the room, there enters a stranger, and the incursion of that extrinsic, extraordinary figure alters and potentially transforms the scene. So in many of the plays of the Irish literary revival, the exterior world is often represented through windows and doors. So the audience has to imagine that these windows and doors, that they point to the outside world, not to the backstage, but to the fields or the sea or the sky. Natural objects are therefore mostly off stage. They are literally waiting in the wings. The stage, going back to Nicky Green's phrase, is where ordinary, familiar life resides. The room is where it happens. Or to put it another way, Irish realism is often a realism without weather. And if you know anything about Ireland, you'll know that that's not very realistic. So there are lots of ways of thinking about this. A book that recently came out that I think addresses some of these issues quite well is The Anthropocene Unconscious by Mark Bould. And he's interested in developing methods to explore how texts that are not about climate change or not about the Anthropocene show people thinking about these things unconsciously anyway. So he says, if you look at symbolism, if you look at what's left out, then you start to see evidence of an Anthropocene unconscious. And I think that's really interesting and a good way of looking at some of those, that the unconscious behavior that theatre is engaged in, those invisible missiles to the future. But Synge is an exception here again. So yes, it's true that in the Playboy of the Western World, we don't see the beach that Christie runs his races on in the Playboy of the Western World. It's off stage. We don't see the ocean that drowns Moira's sons in Riders to the Sea. It's off stage. This is how the outside world often works in the plays of Synge, as something that you have to struggle to keep out of the room. But what we do find is an understanding of the natural world that is not idealized. You don't see the weather, but you see the consequences of the weather all the time. And again, this allows us to identify practical wisdom. Just going back to that example that I gave earlier of the eviction, you might recall that the police were twice pushed back from the island by storms, and that the islanders believed that the storms had been summoned by a witch. So you might read that and dismiss it as a reference to superstition, as an example of the narcissism of the human belief when confronted with natural phenomena, that everything that happens to us happens for us. That it can only be explained in human terms. Synge doesn't agree with that, though, and he's careful to tell us this. What he says is that these people, and it's there on the slide, these people make no distinction between the natural and the supernatural. And he later tells us a story about how he's doing a very simple magic trick. You've probably seen it yourselves, where somebody holds a cord, asks somebody to cut it, and then shows that the cord has been put back together magically. So Synge does that for some of the islanders, and they're amazed and they find it wonderful. "Tell us now," said an old woman when Synge did this trick, "didn't you learn those things from the witches that do be out the country?" So Synge goes on to write about this, and he says that a few of the younger men looked doubtful, but the older people who have watched the rye turning into oats seemed to accept the magic frankly, and they didn't show any surprise that a Dina Uasal, a noble person, should be able to do like the witches. Synge then explains that the miraculous and the irrational are common on the Aran Islands. In these islands alone, miracles enough happen every year to equip a divine emissary, he says. Rye is turned into oats. Storms are raised to keep evictors from the shore. Cows that are isolated on lonely rocks bring forth calves, and other things of the same kind are common. The wonder is a rare expected event, like the thunderstorm or the rainbow, except that it is a little rarer and a little more wonderful. Now that to me sounds a lot like what Amitav Ghosh is saying in The Great Derangement. Again, he pointed out that idea that one of the reasons why there is a climate crisis is because our models of realism have developed in such a way that we cannot present the reality of climate change. He says, it is as though in the literary imagination, climate change were akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel. Synge's Aran Islands, though, give us a world, a real world, in which the inexplicable and the fantastic and the normal all coexist with each other. So the harsh truth of an eviction can coexist in the same breath as the curse of a witch. The rainbow and the miracle are part of the same thing. They're both, they're not divided by their ontology, just by their frequency of their appearance. And this is what's so important about Synge's work, is that he creates a realism that allows fantasy and reality to coexist within the same framework. The best example of that is that in The Playboy of the Western World, Peggy and Mike says, there's a great gap between a gala story and a dirty deed. Synge's realism accommodates both the dirty deed of normal life and the gallant story where we use our imagination. You can see this representation of the natural world in lots of examples. Shadow of the Glen is a very good one. As some of you, I'm sure, will know, this is a play in which an old farmer, he fakes his death in order to prove that his wife is being unfaithful to him. And the ruse is revealed when a tramp visits the house, discovers the deception, and finally persuades the wife to leave the husband in his company instead. So when you read about this play, it's often presented as almost an Irish version of Ibsen's A Doll's House. And that's not unfair. The heroine is called Nora. And as in Ibsen's play, it finishes with the door slamming and her leaving the family home. But there are differences. Synge's Nora doesn't leave willingly. She's thrown out by her husband. And in the case of Ibsen, his Nora, she develops. She moves from naivety to self-knowledge. But this Nora, she's disillusioned at the start of the play and stays disillusioned at the end. Synge's point about Irish life in this play is that nothing changes, that it's paralyzed. Critics of the play, I think they sometimes lose sight of that feature of the play because they're seduced by the poetic language of the tramp. So when he asks Nora to leave, he says, "Come along with me now, lady of the house, and it's not my blather you'll be hearing only, but you'll be hearing the herons crying, oh, for the Black Lakes. And it's not from the likes of them you'll be hearing a tale of getting old like Peggy Kavanagh and losing the hair off you and the light of your eyes, but it's fine songs you'll be hearing when the sun goes up, and there'll be no fellow wheezing the like of a sick sheep close to your ear." So Nora likes this, but she also shows that she knows full well that it's not realistic talk. She says that she herself will soon be wheezing like a sick sheep because she's going to be sleeping outside. But, she says, "You've a fine bit of talk, stranger, and it's with yourself I'll go." So we get the gala story and the dirty deed. Nora knows she's heading off to an impoverished life that will conclude with her premature death, but she chooses poverty with fine talk rather than otherwise. And this frankness about his characters, especially his female characters, runs through all of the plays. And Playboy of the Western World starts, for example, with Peggy and Mike doing a list of things for her wedding. So she's looking for lace boots, she's looking for a yellow gown, a hat, but she also says that she wants a fine tooth comb. So what do we use fine tooth combs for? If you have children, you probably know the answer to that question. You use them to pick head lice out of people's hair. That's what they're for. So Synge is trying to tell us here that Peggy wants to look nice in her yellow dress and her boots, that she wants to throw a party by buying lots of ale, but that she also needs to pick head lice out of her hair before her wedding day, or perhaps her wedding night. And when the play has been done by Galway's Theatre, they often kind of underline this feature of the thing by having Peggy scratch her scalp very vigorously while she's composing this letter. Though in other productions of the play, that detail is often missed. So again, gala story, dirty deed, coexisting. Peggy's fine looks alongside her head lice. So Synge believed that it was possible to give both versions of reality because he said in his preface to The Playboy of the Western World that Ireland is a useful country. The springtime of local life, the harvest is still part of everyday life. The straw has not turned to bricks yet. He said that Ireland was a country where the speech was as fully flavored as a nut or an apple, and that therefore it will have a popular imagination that is fiery and magnificent. But if we're looking for a play that gives us an example of great derangement in the climate, then the best place is to look at Riders to the Sea. So this is a play that is set in a cottage on the Aran Islands, and it's a treatment of the tragic poverty of these islanders. It's putting on stage a culture in which women are forced to bury their husbands and their brothers and their sons. And of course, a society with no men is a society that will soon die out. So understandably, people, when they saw this play originally, they often found it very pessimistic, but they also treated with great reverence. So much so that on the opening night of the Playboy of the Western World in 1907, the Abbey directors decided to use Riders to the Sea as a curtain raiser, hoping that the popularity of the play would put people in the right frame of mind to see the Playboy. It didn't work, they still rioted, but it shows you something of how the play was thought of. So again, you could look at Riders to the Sea with an anthropologist's point of view. So the stage directions, they're very specific, they're very authentic. And Synge took huge care to ensure that it was accurate. So he wrote to friends in the Aran Islands to ask them for pampooties, which is the special kind of footwear that the islanders use, because he wanted to ensure that his actors had the right kind of clothing. He looked at the way they stitched their clothes, their flannel, and so on. So there's a huge amount in this play about the everyday life of the islanders. Perhaps the best example of that is that it concludes with a keen. Now the keen, it comes from the Irish word for crying or a cry, and it's part of a funeral ritual where usually female mourners would cry melodically over a coffin as part of a funeral ritual. So the staging of the keen at the Abbey Theatre, this meant that the Abbey was almost taking on a kind of ethnological function. You can see all through the 19th century, again, it appeared in lots of illustrated magazines. But this is almost like the Abbey working as a kind of living museum. And it's worth recollecting that at this time in European culture, there were a lot of living museums inspired by things like Barnum's, famous American Museum of Curiosities, which looks nothing like The Greatest Showman, but never mind. But also by, considerably more racist practices, like this one. This is the recreation of a Somali village. And this was staged in Dublin in 1907, which is the same year that the Playboy of the Western World was performed. So it's really important to think about that the people who are going to see the Playboy of the Western World were also going to see this Somali village, and how those two different ways of seeing things might have fed into each other. So that's the ethnography. The play, of course, is also an impressive work of art. And we heard earlier that Synge's original ambition was to be a musician rather than a playwright, and that's what brought him to Würzburg, after all. He may have left behind music, but this play shows that he also brought several features of it with him. The first sounds you hear in this play, they're not voices, they're other kinds of sounds. So you've got one of the daughters who's kneading dough, so she brings it down to the table almost in a percussive manner. And then she spins a wheel, which again creates a rhythmic and percussive sound. So when Druid Theatre staged this particular scene in 2006, I'm just going to let this play and talk over it. You can see the way that it's directed is that these characters are being dwarfed by their environment almost. Now, again, just thinking of the internet connection, I'm not going to play the whole thing. Hear that beat almost? There's the spinning wheel. Hear the wind. And it continues for another few minutes. Now, again, if we had more time, I would have shown you about 3 minutes of that, but I'm not going to. But I think there's enough there to make the point. This production is 27 minutes long, but nobody speaks until the 4th minute, because what we have before that is the establishing of that sound of wind and also the work that the people are doing, the hardship, all of that represented with this kind of syncopated rhythm. And I think what the direction is doing there is it's making very clear that the sea surrounding these islands, it's not a metaphor, it's not a symbol, it's not about pathetic fallacy, it's much bigger than human life. It's incomparably vast. And you can think about that in relation to some of the stuff that's been written about climate change. So one of the most interesting theorists of climate change is Timothy Morton, who's proposed the need to think about the climate crisis by saying that we need to have a better understanding of what he calls hyperobjects, which he defines as things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. So anything that we know exists but is too big for us to understand within the realm of our own mind is a hyperobject. Plastic is a hyperobject. The solar system is a hyperobject. The climate is a hyperobject. Synge would not have recognized the term hyperobjects, and I suspect he probably wouldn't have liked the word all that much. But I think his writing shows a really clear understanding of that concept of things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans that are incomparably vast, because that's what the Atlantic Ocean is for the characters in this play. We can see that in lots of different ways. The musicality of it, though, continues. You've got, you know, the fact that the sentences start off very short and they become longer as it goes along, culminating in this long monologue by Maura at the end. So although it's a short play, it's surprisingly musical. And that's why I think it's so interesting that the English composer, Ray Vaughan Williams, was able to create an opera version of this in 1927. Didn't premiere for a couple of years after that. But if you ever have an opportunity to listen to it, it's amazing how faithful it is to Synge's original script. It's amazing how fluidly it fits in. Now, as with a lot of Synge's other scripts, I'm moving towards the conclusion now, the origins of Riders to the Sea can be found in the Aran Islands. So in the Aran Islands, Synge tells us about a funeral of a young man who had drowned at sea. And so while he's at the funeral, some of the islanders start to tell him stories of other islanders who died. And he hears about a woman who had died and she was buried, but the night after her funeral, she came back to her family home. So she had died in childbirth, but she came back to her family home to nurse her newly born child who had survived, and went away again, came back the next night, nursed the child again, and went away. So her family members, needless to say, were a bit perturbed by this. And so they asked her what was going on. And she said that she had been stolen by the fairies, and that if her family wanted to get her back, what they needed to do is the following. She said they would all be leaving that part of the country on the Ihahauna, which is Halloween, and that there would be 400 or 500 of them riding on horses, and she would be on a grey horse riding behind a young man. She told them to go down to a bridge they would be crossing that night and to wait at the head of it. And when she would be coming up, she would slow the horse and they would be able to throw something on her and the young man, and they would fall over the ground and be saved. So her family did that. She was saved. And as it says here, in the end, she died, but only after having 4 children more. So Synge is listening to these stories while also observing the grief of the islanders in response to a real death of a young man. And he responds with empathy, but also with despondency. And this is what he writes. As they talked to me and gave me a little poutine and a little bread when they thought I was hungry, I couldn't help feeling that I was talking with men who were under a judgment of death. I knew that every one of them would be drowned in the sea in a few years and battered naked on the rocks, or would die in his own cottage and be buried with another fearful scene in the graveyard I had come from. Amazing writing. So both of those stories find their way into Riders to the Sea. It gives us the mother and her drowned son, but it also gives us the ghost on horseback. So again, I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but there's the scene where Moira talks about walking down to the sea and seeing her 2 sons riding past on horses. And this is how she knows that they're dead, is because they've gone off on horseback. Now, her daughter, Nora, she doubts the accuracy of this vision and she appeals to religion. She says, didn't the young priest say the Almighty God wouldn't leave her destitute with no one living? So the Catholic priest says that the boys will be found alive. But Moira responds in Synge's stage direction, says in a low voice but clearly, it's little the like of him knows of the sea. So this is really interesting. The natural and the supernatural, the death of the boy, the ghost, all of that is on one side of the lived experience of these islanders. He knows so little of the sea. The priest doesn't get it. So there's a kind of interesting irony here that the play that, you know, Synge is most famous for being authentic in features a ghost. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think all of these passages give us really useful ways to think about the human relationship to the natural world as imagined by Synge. First of all, in the Aran Islands, in the plays, he sees the natural and the supernatural existing on the same place. So he makes space for the boy who drowns in the sea, but also for the way that natural phenomena can seem fantastical. The sea that can produce waves that are dozens of meters high just when police are about to arrive to evict people. I'm not saying we should take Synge literally and believe in ghosts, but I find it interesting that this is a version of the natural world that corresponds to a lot of the points that we get in The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. And again, there is this understanding of the natural world as something that is far greater than the human. Think about the conclusion of Riders to the Sea, where Moira says, "No man can be living forever, and we must be satisfied." So in this play, humanity is dwarfed by the waves, by the ocean, and we must accept our place with humility. That's what the play is saying. One of the great ecological writers, Aldo Leopold, once proposed that in order to understand how the world works, we should all learn to think like mountains. Because, he said, mountains exist for millions of years and they allow interconnections that we just can't understand. Well, we in Ireland, we don't have many mountains, just 31 mountain ranges, mostly around the coast. So I often think we can't really think like mountains. You know, we can think like cliffs. We have a lot of really good cliffs in Ireland, including some very impressive ones on the Aran Islands. So this is Inishmore, the big island, and that's the cliff at Dún Aengus. That's a 3,000-year-old prehistoric fort that gazes out upon what would have been the edge of the known world when it was created. And then on Inishmaan, there are lots of nice smaller cliffs, including this one that has now come to be known as Qatar Singh, which means Synge's chair. And this is the place where Synge looked out at the Atlantic himself and has now been named for him. I think it makes a lot of sense to me that Synge was attracted to the view from the cliff edge because, you know, he spent most of his life on the precipice of death. He died 11 years after he first visited the Aran Islands at a tragically young age. He wasn't even close to 40. And I wonder sometimes if that's why he identified so strongly with the Aran Islanders, because they were people who lived on the precipice too. They were on the edge of this Atlantic Ocean that gave them a living, but also hung over them like a death sentence. They lived on the edge of Europe, and they were in a state that was so primitive that it almost seemed to have the grandeur of Greek tragedy, or to be like a Wagner opera, like Tannhauser, which Synge spent so much time in Würzburg learning how to play on the piano. Synge was on the Aran Islands as an observer, but he constantly spills over into empathy. And he empathizes with people on the edge. This is one of his photos. Look at that woman there who's looking out from the crowd and thinking about things herself. Look at the person in this composition, this photograph, the person who he notices here. It's not the adults looking away from the camera, it's the child peeking away. Very similar to that painting of the Eviction that I showed you at the start. Those are the people that Synge is interested in, the people on the edges and the margins whom we might have neglected to see ourselves. Well, we all live on a cliff edge now on the precipice of this new era that some people call the Anthropocene. That is a disputed word, but it connotes the indisputable fact that the natural world that many of us were born into is gone. And I think we can read Synge to understand better what it is like to live on this cliff edge. He doesn't shy away from bleakness. He may have a fine bit of talk, but he won't deny that vagrants die from exposure, or that the Aran Islanders are likely to die at sea. But he also wrote that life is a symphony. He said that life works through the combination of disparate parts into a whole, like an ecosystem, you might say. The Irish poet Paula Meehan has recently suggested that the role of the artist during the Anthropocene is to scan time coded in the golden hive of memory. And what she means is that we must learn from the past if we're to have any kind of secure future. Rereading Synge is an important part of scanning coded time in the golden hive of our memory. There is a great gap between a gala story and a dirty deed, Synge knew, but he wants us to think about both. And by doing so, he gives us the tools to accept the reality of the challenges we must face. But he also reminds us of the beauties of the world that we live in as well, and of our own place in it. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick, for this intriguing, fascinating, and also very enlightening talk. I think we can open the floor now for questions. So if you have a question or comment, maybe, can you use your artificial hand because it is easier to see who wants to ask a question. Yes, Antonius.
This might devolve into rambling, but I'll try to kind of compose my thoughts. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting talk, especially since I'm not that well versed when it comes to theater and plays, since I come more from a literature side of research. But what I think is interesting, we can, of course, also apply this concept of this border existence and this existence, coexistence with nature, and then especially with drowning, I think this being consumed by nature. We can also apply this to the Irish emigration during the Great Famine. So thinking about coffin ships, especially, many people who died on them were, of course, then buried at sea. So in this way, we also see how the Atlantic, while it on one hand serves as this kind of symbol of hope, away from devastation, this kind of the other world, new beginning in America on one hand, but on the other hand, frequent storms, cold weather. In the voyage of Brandon, of course, it wasn't the Atlantic Ocean in the same way that it was traversed during the 19th century. But of course, pillars of ice, or icebergs really, were seen as this kind of pillars of diamond, which of course brings us back to this kind of something that's natural, but then seen as supernatural, which we already, of course, see in older texts, but then also in texts during the famine, during the Exodus, but also historical novels that are contemporary historical novels that also feature on that time. So what I think is really the most interesting aspect here is how this coexistence with nature is essentially ambiguous, arbitrary, especially also when thinking about the importance of the hearth at home and the connection to nature on one hand, but on the other hand, only, at least in place, seeing nature from one's own window. So inside the house, nature is kind of far away, and the home is this kind of safe space. And then, of course, we have evictions, we have uprootedness, which then would thrust one into nature. But after evictions, we frequently see the fate of premature death. So, like I said, I'm sorry for rambling, but I just think it's an interesting thought that is almost universally applicable. So not only to plays, to literature, I think as well.
Yeah. I think that's a really fascinating series of observations. You covered a huge amount there in a short period as well. I just want to add one thing, which is that one of the other important Irish stories about the Atlantic Ocean is the Titanic, right? You know, built in Belfast, its last embarkation point was a town in County Cork, now called Cove. A lot of Irish people died in that boat. A lot of Irish people built that boat. And the kind of the place that it occupies in the Irish imagination is really important, I think. But again, when people think about the Titanic, it's usually seen as a symbol of hubris, of the human overconfidence in the face of nature, which I think, again, is an interesting way of looking at that for our own times.
Thank you very much. Matthias has the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick, for this very, very interesting lecture. It strikes me that the person of John Millington Synge, and I think we could see it and hear it from your lecture also, is a unity of a person that incorporates one view, which is can be seen in his writing, and also you showed a number of photographs he took himself. it's always the same perspective of this person, John Millington Synge, towards people he's looking at. As a playwright and also as a photographer, or somebody who is just a keen walker or cyclist in his days. So I think this was very interesting to learn from your lecture, that Synge was always interested in nature and also in the ordinary people or the rural people, which makes him maybe different from other authors. You mentioned a short passage from William Butler Yeats, who is a completely different person. And this is the striking characteristic of John Millington Synge for me, that he was always interested in nature. And even as a student in Dublin, he was doing naturalist studies, maybe not very seriously, but he was always interested in these things. So maybe you're right that we can learn from his writings and from his perspective towards the world as a writer, and also a person interested in what surrounds him. So thank you very much for pointing out this trace of Synge's character.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's nice to be able, I know we talked about how it's possible in Würzburg to follow in Synge's footsteps, and to walk around and see some of the places that he saw.
Yeah.
And one of the nicest ways to understand Ireland is to do the same thing in the places that Synge went to, whether that's Wicklow or Kerry or Galway or Connemara or the Aran Islands, because he had such a good eye that if you follow in his footsteps, you'll certainly find something worth seeing, I think. I can see other people want to get in, so I'm keeping my
yes, yeah. But thank you very much for this comment, Matthias. And yeah, Mary Ann is next one.
Whoops, I'm sorry. I also wanted to thank you very much for the lecture and for the thoughts and the arguments that concern something that I think we all have thought about and tried to figure out. And that might be summed up as, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to imagine, to grasp, to think about, to do something about climate change? And one of the takeaways from your remarks today, for me, is I would say is that there's not one blanket reason, but they're very local, specific configurations that lead it to be particularly hard, not for different everyones, for different groups. So I found that really striking and really interesting. And now I have that's an observation. And now I have two questions, or like a proposal and an open question. And the first would concern perhaps the question of, why is it so difficult in the configuration of Ireland to think and do something about climate change? And I wonder if this is just such a terrible generalization, but I wonder if it does make a difference that historically Ireland, of course, has been on the short end of the stick in terms of power, the long history of colonization and so forth. So maybe there's sort of a difficulty there it would seem like climate change is the thing that's done by great powers, that's done to others, done to Ireland, not something that Ireland might be doing. And again, I wonder if that's just a terrible generalization, but I wonder also if there might be something to that. And then I also wondered about the limits and also the potentials of the theater for gaining connection to climate change in this topic. Because here I'm thinking of a conversation I had, I think this was for COVID, because I think we were actually in a room together, with someone who works at the theater in Würzburg, talking about such issues. And because I'm a literary studies person, so my perspective is always, we need to have a better story. We need a more convincing story to motivate people. And her position as a theater person, as someone who does theater, she said that stories are inadequate. What you need is experience. And that is why theater is the better, more powerful medium for trying to activate people also about climate change. And that example that you gave us a little snippet of with the sounds and so forth would seem to move in that direction. So I would wonder about your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, great observations. Thank you very much. I mean, the Irish case it's complicated, as you say, same as everywhere else. One example that I would call attention to, though, is that in the 1950s, Ireland began to invest quite heavily in electricity generating stations, and they used turf to power those. And if you look at a lot of the kind of the state, I don't want to say propaganda, but state self-promotion at the time, it was very much along the lines of, we are proving our worthiness of being independent by at last using our own natural resource to burn stuff and make electricity. So there was a belief, therefore, that for Ireland to develop into a civilized independent country, they had to pollute in the same way that their nearest neighbors had been polluting. So again, you can see that in the 50s very clearly. And I think it's significant. You go to the Abbey Theatre and you're seeing plays where people are burning turf. There's a clear alignment there that I think deserves to be dug into and could be very helpful for the present. In relation, I fully agree with what you're saying about theatre as providing an experience that people can go through. I'd make, this is an obvious thing to say, and I know you're not saying this, but I would make the observation, reading a book, of course, can also be an experience. And a very good example of that, I don't know if you've come across the Australian novelist Claire Thomas wrote a book called The Performance. And what she does is it's a performance of Samuel Beckett's play Endgame. What she does is she focuses on the experiences of different members of the audience who are watching this play while forest fires are going on outside and they're wondering about their relations. And so as an example of what you're talking about, of what can theatre do and what can literature do, it's brilliant actually for exploring both. So I just mentioned that as it is.
Thank you for this question, Marianne. We have actually run out of time, and I would also have many more questions, but I think we can just take Ina's and Antonio's, okay, and finish then. So Ina.
Yeah, I'll be real quick. Thank you very much, Patrick, for this very exciting and thought-provoking. I think it already came out in the previous comments and questions paper today. I would like to come back to something that you said in your conclusion, and you said we could draw lessons from the past. We can draw a historical lesson from the writings of past writers, and that's something that I have, or that's kind of an argument that I have used. Some of my students are already smirking, that I have used in not only in my seminars, but in some of my writing about the American historical novel. And but I've become a bit ambivalent about it, but because I think, and I would just like to know your opinion about it, because it sounded very hopeful. And to me, it's become something like, it's there, but we're just not using this information. It's out there, and it could be used, and we could salvage literature of all kinds, or to make another point, historical documents for historical lessons that would help us and teach us how to deal with the present time and the future. And whether you feel that's really something that people would see as an option for acting out. And I should add that some of the people here are in a class that's called History in Stories, and that focuses on just that, and that will also have a symposium in July where we will talk about history and stories, the Irish past and the challenges of the present, of course with a broader trajectory, but maybe I'm just looking for you to make me less skeptic about it, and cheer us up at the end of this evening.
It's absolutely hard not to be skeptical. And wasn't it Frederick Jameson, I think, who said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think an example I often give, there was a recently published book called The Physics of Climate Change, and it was written by a very distinguished scientist who had published a lot of popular science books to explain to people how things work. So he wrote this book about the physics of climate change, saying if people have information, they'll be well equipped, they'll be optimistic, they know what they can do. And he brought it to publishers, and the publishers kept saying, yeah, we don't really do that kind of climate change book. We're much more interested in the apocalyptic stuff. So they wouldn't publish a book that was going to give people hope and knowledge. And I think there's something there about the way, when we watch, like there's lots of climate change documentaries on streaming services, and the reason they feel overwhelming and make us sad is because you don't feel like getting out and doing something, you just watch more Netflix. This is part of the way that we're being told that we can't do anything. So if it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, well, let's look at the people who've imagined other ways of being, whether it's Ursula Le Guin's science fiction, or whether it's, Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking novels, or Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, or whatever. I mean, there are ways of living there that we can look at and learn from. So I understand the feeling of being overwhelmed, but I wouldn't be pessimistic.
Okay, thank you for this nice answer. Antonius, what about you? Do you have maybe a wee question?
I'll try to keep it short. Maybe I can just go on the question of hope and really how to incite this, because essentially I also understand the skepticism when it comes to historical novels, because people might read it in a kind of cathartic way. So, oh, that's terrible, but it doesn't happen to me, so it's okay. Instead, where we should rather strive towards a more Brechtian way of, well, this really made me think maybe we need to change something. And now, of course, there's no universal answer to this, but how would you maybe suggest that theater especially can capture a contemporary audience to make them more aware of what's really going on around them? And I know there's no clear-cut answer, I think, but just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, there are lots of good examples of it. I mean, there are playwrights like Chantal Bilodeau, who has written plays set in all of the different countries in the Arctic Circle. This is an ongoing process. She hasn't finished them yet, but so that's been interesting. I'm very interested in people who stage their works in outdoors, people who do things like they put Macbeth on in caves, so that, when you're listening to Lady Macbeth talking about bats, there are actual real bats nearby. I think particularly, the theatre of Shakespeare was written to be performed outside, and not in every case, but in a lot of his plays were. So if we get outside and actually see it in the world, a world where, you can see birds flying past you as you watch the play, I think it works really well in that context. But there are loads of examples of people doing interesting things.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again for the fantastic inaugural lecture that we could listen to, and also for your comprehensive answers on all our questions. I'm sure we would have many more questions, but we finally have to stop here. And yes, I think it was a great start actually into our lecture series. So thanks again. Would the ISWÜ team please stay in this room, and for all the others, have a great evening, enjoy yourselves, and hopefully we see you all soon. Bye-bye.